come to Art 9, and we come to two of the greatest artists of the 20th century. One of them was the greatest sculptor since Michelangelo, and his name was Henry Moore. The other is the greatest painter in China for the last 300 years, and his name is Qi Baishi, or as it's pronounced now, Qi Baishi. Most of the artists that we're taking are persons that lived very long lives. George O'Keeffe lived to be 99, Qi Baishi lived to be 97, Frank Lloyd Wright lived to be 93, Henry Moore 88, Max Ernst 86. They're all very long-lived artists. One of the most difficult things for our time, our generation, to appreciate is a kind of an offset skew that has occurred. When it first occurred about 300 years ago, it was so little understood that it just occupied a few people, mostly mathematicians. And as the 18th century, the 1700s went further on, it began to affect a very large, yet very numerically small percentage of the population, and it was called the Enlightenment. And it meant having a clear mind. And the offset was started by Sir Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, 1787. Up until that time, almost everywhere in the world, there was an integration of mentality with the natural cycle. Newton's Principia Mathematica was so extraordinarily brilliant in that it showed that if you abstract intelligence in a very special way, its precision becomes asymptotically greater than natural precision. That Newtonian mathematical universe precision is precise to any degree of specification. As the 1700s went on, the offset reaching more people, there was an international group of people in the Enlightenment who were sticklers for organization, for mental clarity, for not going back to nature, but to going to the clarity of mental forms, symbolic structures. We want to have a mathematically precise, mechanically secure understanding of everything and every detail. And one of the things that came out of it was the beginnings of encyclopedias. The great French encyclopedia of Diderot and d'Alembert, the original Encyclopedia Britannica, and also dictionaries, Samuel Johnson's great dictionary, the beginnings of Noah Webster's dictionary in the United States, encyclopedias and dictionaries, technical manuals. And by the 18th century, there was a struggle that was just emerging, and in the 19th century, it broke out increasingly in warfare. It was the warfare between science and religion, as they said. The 1800s was progressively disenchanted by science, and science was progressively disenchanted by everyone else. And you had someone like Darwin come along with his theory of evolution, that upped the ante on the Newtonian world, saying not only are we going to be precise to an extent that none of you even guessed, but we're going to show you exactly how all this came about. One of the difficulties of modern art is that it was the membranes, the interface of two membranes. One was the membrane of the symbolic mind that truly is an integral form, an integral structure, can be known. The brain has an integral structure. Not only just the paired hemispheres and the different areas, but all of the gestalts of neuronal netting are now increasingly coming out and being well known. It's a definite fact. It's like a super wise, mysterious cauliflower that thinks and can think very clearly, but can also do something which it assumed that it was doing and did not. And so in the 21st century, we have to make a clear distinction between the symbolic mind and consciousness. And that the pride of science, the base of science, which is theory, takes place in consciousness and does not take place in the symbolic mind. Now, this is not believable by any but just a handful of human beings alive, but is sustainable by actual experience and proof. And one of the great proving grounds is not only in science, but in art. And so we're taking a look at the way in which art and science are both non-integral forms. They are differential forms. And the process of theory is a differential consciousness. And in the original word, in Greek, theoria translates directly as contemplation. It's not that you think of a theory, but that theoria is an absorptive flow. It is an energizing, and that energizing flow as a process has as its characteristic remembering. Not the memory, but remembering. The process of remembering. How many visionaries report they've been told, write down what you see in a book to remember it. Teach this to the others so that they may know it and remember it. But remembering in differential consciousness, in the theoria, in the contemplative theory, has an ability to recursively go back into the mind, back into the symbolic mind, and when it does, it assumes the character of a structural form in the mind called the memory. And so memory is actually a symbolic construct, a form of the mind, but remembering is a process of differential consciousness. But just as remembering can go into the mind and there take on the accoutrement of a structure of symbolic thought, an aspect of symbolic thought that is very core to it, called the imagination, goes into differential consciousness and becomes their creative imagination. In the symbolic mind, One can, through contemplative practices, through long prayer practices. In the Greek Orthodox Church for 2,000 years, they've had a technique called prayer without end. One doesn't say a prayer, one prays without end. It's a form of contemplation, a form of meditation. And in this, one comes across the absorptive quality of being in the flow of consciousness. And the consciousness is a remembering that continually opens up. The best possible way to quickly get it is a discovery made by a Polish mathematician who lived in France for a long time and then came to the United States and worked for IBM. His name is Mandelbrot, and he discovered fractals. The fractal universe, that fractal dimension, is a graphic way of disclosing the differential consciousness that opens and opens and opens. It doesn't open to integrate like nature does. Nature will have variations, but will always work those variations back into an integral. Always. You can count on it. It does that. But that's only half of reality. The other half of reality is that it doesn't really go into variations to reintegrate, but it goes into differentials to continue to differentiate and go out. Creative imagination is like turning a siren into an alert that this is very important, because creative imagination is a dynamic, whereas the imagination is an energeia. Forms are always energy that are brought into a sync, and they have a polarizing quality to them. It can be positive or negative, yin or yang, whatever you choose. It will always have a equanimous symmetricality based on polarity that confers stability. So that the forms of ritual and the forms of symbol are all integral forms, but the forms of art and the forms of science are differential forms. And it takes a transform to be able to use the one, and then it takes a second transform to be able to use that other with the first so that they work together. One of the biggest difficulties in our time is that we have inklings about the first transformation and we have no idea whatsoever of the second. The first transformation is like a fermentation, but the second transformation is like a distillation. But the words convey integral impressions to those who are not learned. Whereas the fermentation is a process that if you let it go too long, you don't get just wine, but you can get vinegar. You have to use a balanced judgment, and that's what makes a good vintner, of how far you let that go before you bottle it. And how long can it be in the bottles before it will turn to vinegar? It will sour. And some great wines are made so that the fermentation timeline is very long. But you cannot make a cognac by fermentation. It's made by distillation. You have to have the wine first, then you distill it. Science is a distillation of art. Art is the wine, and science is the cognac. And when science is really done, it is extraordinary. And what Newton and Darwin did is really science, but the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who eventually came to their work after several generations or sometimes after several centuries and learned it through instruction in schools that were completely blinded by just trying to get the lesson across to the students so you could pass the exams. That whole process sieved and filtered and reduced science down to a kind of extended ritual. One time in a conversation on a terrace in Escana, Switzerland, Carl Jung broke out in a laugh that echoed across the lake, and everyone said, well, why is Dr. Jung laughing so loud? And he said to the young woman who had just talked about how wonderful modern science is, he said, my dear, modern science is 95% meal talk. It isn't about science at all. It's about doing your work and getting through the day, getting your grants, getting your papers in, whereas real science has creative imagination that is juiced up 3 orders beyond vision. That's very high. That's extraordinary. And it turns out that the way that art and science come together is that they don't come together as integrals, but they come into polishing like a lens. And there are some people who have very large lenses. The biggest telescopic lens in the world was ground in Spain over the last 7 or 8 years and will come online at the beginning of 2007. It's 10.4 meters. It's a big telescope. It's a lens that is ground in such a way that every component of it is an hexagon that is individually balanced so that the light, the photons coming in from space through the atmosphere into the telescope, that every aspect of the telescope slightly changes to make sure that the focus is pinpoint accurate. And so this 10.4 meter telescope is constantly adjusting itself. It's called adaptive optics. We're doing a learning here that allows for your person and for your advanced cosmic form to use an adaptive optics education so that you can improve yourself and refine yourself indefinitely. There are no boundaries. There are no limits. There are no end points. There's no big crunch. One of the qualities is then to recognize that the standard use of words is severely crimped. And so we have to wean ourselves away. And one of the ways that I do this is I use a delivery poetic structure rather than an instructional rhetorical angle to the way that I talk. I talk like a jazz player would play. You can recognize the melody somewhat, but it's always in some kind of improv presentation. And so I speak like Milt Jackson plays the vibes, or like Paul Desmond used to play the alto sax. I speak in that kind of a way. It's a poetic improv, not to baffle you, but to baffle the standard habitual hearing and the standard habitual mentalizing, which leads one astray before you even have a chance to know that there's any astray. When we come to art, we've taken 2 pairs of great artists so far. Now we're coming to a 3rd pair. And what we're doing here is a classic phase step. We're presenting something. I call it in education in the way in which it's put down in the course outline. I call it setting up a current. Then the next step, the second step, are resonances in that current. And the resonances will then be wave fronts of the energy waves. And the third is the harmonic that those sets create and make together. And so differential forms, differential conscious forms, have this ability to take the flow of a kind of a gas and liquefy it and then solidify it in a way that it makes a lens and not just some kind of dense object. So that differential forms are made to look through prismatically rather than to acquire and then have a kind of a certainty because they're always exactly what they are. Differential forms are always being whatever they can be and not just being what they were or what supposedly they are or especially what they must be. You were told to be good, whereas being really good as an alive differential human being is to be outdoing all kinds of things, including new things. And even in that range, making mistakes is all right. It was put into a very interesting expression one time. A Danish philosopher named Søren Kierkegaard. He said Immanuel Kant used to ask a categorical imperative question that before you do anything, you must ask yourself, what if everyone did this? And very often you must not do this because what if everyone did this? But Kierkegaard said the existential imperative is to ask yourself, what if no one did this? The universe might be minus a value, so give it a try. It's a completely different outlook, but it's not an outlook because the first one is not an outlook, it's an in-look. But the fact is that if you carry an in-look far enough, the inward looking comes to a liminality beyond which it does not go. You can resolve anything integrally to a single pointedness. Great meditative geniuses like the historical Buddha, or great brilliant persons like Jesus, they could resolve anything, not only to its single pointedness, but vanish that point. So that what occurred then was complete openness. In that openness, there is no size. There is no time. And so it's not just that that point has vanished into a point of openness, which is there, or wherever that is, but that it is now of infinite size or zero size. Either way, the logic actually works out. And it is both eternal and timeless. Timeless meaning that it's not bound, it's in time, but is not bound. There's no end to the time. Or it's eternal in that, like infinity, there's no calibration. Zero is timeless, but infinity is eternal. It's ancient wisdom. We're looking at two artists, Henry Moore and Chi Pai Shi, to give us that harmonic, that third step in art. And one of the interesting things is that both of them came from the humblest possible origins. I'm going to talk about Henry Moore more in a bit, but he was born in a coal mining ghetto in Yorkshire, England, and his father was a coal miner. Their little bungalow was the same as several thousand other bungalows, all made out of the same red brick, all arranged in rows, with a closed alleyway courtyard that had the toilets at the end. And everybody worked in the coal mines. And there were 2 rooms down below and 2 bedrooms up above. And almost all the living was done in the back room, because that's where the kitchen stove was, that's where the table to eat, that's where most of the family lived, no matter how many children. Henry Moore's mother gave birth to 8 children. She raised them all. 2 of them died as young infants. But the front room was saved, and the phrase was for a long time, even when I was a boy in the United States, the front room is for special guests. The family room is in the back. And then the 2 bedrooms, 1 bedroom for all the children, and the other bedroom for the man and his wife. And that was it. And you had to go outside and down the alleyway if you had to go to the loo. Henry Moore came out of that. He was born in 1898, and he said constantly through his life that he was grateful for that childhood, because he said, I lived a real life. There were never any illusions about anything. And he kept that Yorkshire determined coal miner's son simplicity, even when he became the most famous artist in the world, even more famous than Picasso, the most famous artist of the 20th century. There are more Henry Moore sculptures around the world, everywhere, every country you can imagine, than there are Picassos or anybody else. Henry Moore is the most planetary artist, because you will find his sculptures almost in any country that you go into, a place of pride, but also a place of neglect. One of the beautiful volumes that has come out on Henry Moore, published by Harry Abrams, and photographs by a friend of Henry Moore's who took some time to be with him. I want to just show you this photograph of Moore. Yeah. This is David Finn's nice portrait of Henry Moore in his 70s, standing by one of his sculptures. And he said he went to photograph one of Moore's sculptures that is across the street on a little strip of grass from the British House of Lords, one of the power places in England. You betcha. Nobody was there looking at it. And the Bobby, the policeman that came by, said, "What are you doing here? You're not supposed to be on this grass." He said, "I'm taking photographs for a book on Henry Moore. This is one of his sculptures." And the Bobby said, "It's a piece of trash, isn't it? Everyone knows that. No one looks at this. And especially not them across the street." So the greatest artist in the world at that time, in terms of popularity and distribution, also almost understood by just a minuscule fraction of a percent of the human beings alive. Whereas on the other hand, Qi Baishi was born in the early 1860s in what is Hunan province. The big city in Hunan is Changsha, and that's where Mao Zedong was born. And Hunan, if you've ever had Chinese food, Hunan food is a little bit spicy, not as much as Sichuan, but it has just a nice balance so that the spiciness is tasty rather than hot. So Hunan food is like that. Hunan people are like that. They're a little bit rascally, a little bit individual. When he was born into a farming family. Everybody farmed. That's what they did. They were farmers. They were peasant farmers. but he was not very strong. And so they let him go to school until he was 12. And then when he was 12, they put him to work on the farm. Well, maybe he's grown enough, he's strong enough, and he was supposed to plow, and he couldn't hold the plow. It kept twisting, and the animals would take the plow away, couldn't plow straight. So they said, well, it's obvious he can't be a farmer. Well, what are we going to do with him? So the father said, well, they need carpenters. Let's have him apprentice and be a carpenter. But he was so frail, he couldn't carry the heavy wood. So they were scratching their communal heads, what are we going to do with him? And they decided, he can be a carpenter, but he'll make cabinets. And so he was apprenticed, and he learned for the first time to take what they call a steel brush, which is a little set of chisels, to carve the little motifs. And the motifs that they carved in those days on cabinetry for the peasants were peasant things that they liked. They liked little things of like cats, or of butterflies, or dragonflies, insects, of little mice and things. And so he learned how to carve these little things on cabinets, and he became extraordinarily good at it. And one day, when he was about 20 years old, he got a commission from a rather wealthy peasant in the next village or so down the way to come and do some carving for the whole house, and to also instruct one of the wives in art and calligraphy. And while he was there, he noticed a book, a Chinese book, on the shelf, and it was the Mustard Seed Garden, Manual Garden of Work, translated here. Subentitled here, A Study of the Ritual Disposition of Chinese Painting, translation from the 17th century. So it is about the same time as Newton's Principia Mathematica. So in China, this book became the encyclopedia of all painting and art. And as you go through it, every conceivable thing is covered in detail by examples. And the little peasant decided that he was going to make his own study of it, and for 6 months he studied it. It's an amazing thing how incredibly adept Qi Shi was at it. And as he studied it, in the Mustard Seed Garden, the Tao of Painting, it's got a paper translation excerpt called The Way of Chinese Painting. The translator was a little Chinese woman about 5 feet tall, I might say, and brilliant, bright, very small, hair nicely collected together, and she made this fantastic translation. And in the introduction on Tao and the Tao, there's a section in here which is and was for Qi Shi extremely important, because it focused on qi. Now, qi, or qi as it's pronounced now, is the energy. The qi circulates in one's body, circulates in one's physiology, and it's this qi that is the way in which energy in nature comes into the body, circulates, and has its being. But qi also is capable of a subtle transform, and when it transforms, it's now called shen, or spirit. It's a different thing. So here, she's translating the manual's quoting of the Leonardo da Vinci of Chinese civilization. His Chinese name was Wang Shoujian, but he's always known as Wang Yangming. He lived from the 1470s to the late 1520s. And he's the one that put together all of the great disciplines of China, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, and braided them together so that they became this fabulous chord of all three in one, because he took them out of their forms and put them into their distinct processes. Then he modulated the three processes together so that they would have a different way of revealing. That their dynamic together now wasn't just the dynamic of nature or the dynamic of experience, but was also the dynamic of consciousness. So that nature, experience, and consciousness flowed together. And when they flow together, they braid, not like you would braid something that is integral and distinct, but they twirl together, and one calls us in mathematics today twisters. This is a very, very high, powerful, high dimensionality, and Wang Yangming brought that into play. The Taoist and Buddhist practice of meditation, following exercises in controlling and regulating the breath, the human qi, drawing on the qi of the universe, was one of the means they believed in helpful in emptying the heart of distractions, of selfishness, of ignorance, what Wang Yangming called obscurations, in order to be able to reflect clearly, not on the Tao, but the Tao. But the word here, reflect, is incorrect because it isn't reflect, it is to absorb and to radiate the absorption. So they would use a mirror to hold in front of them to make sure that when they got to that transform, there would be no breath on the mirror whatsoever. You would not be breathing breath, but you would be breathing spiritually. And out of that technique came the secret of the golden flower. That what one circulates now is not air, but shen, and what comes out is not breath, but light. So that one now has a body of light. It is out of that light that the magic of creative imagination is able to bring art into being. Let's take a break. Let's come back to Qi. The name means white stone energy. I'll talk about it in a little bit. This is a sample of one of his paintings, one of his scrolls. And you can see the figure is on a bridge that leads out. It doesn't lead to any place, it leads out. It's like a spirit trail in a Navajo rug. The one thread that's not a part of the composition or the fabric, it leads out. It's the way in which one is able to circulate around in a work of art and then exit it. To come in and circulate around and then go out. So that a life becomes a beautiful fabric, which is a pattern of the integral and the differential, but it has an open way in, it has an openness at the center, and it has an open way out to go on. Qi. This is in Beijing, 1956. He became the most famous painter in several hundred years in China. And he became a national hero for all the decades, even during, and especially during, the time when the Japanese took over northern China. In 1931, one of the largest ports in Manchuria, capital Mukden, now called Shenyang, was taken over by the Japanese military, and eventually most of China was taken over by the Japanese military. And the Japanese were very fond of Chi Paishi's paintings. He posted a sign on his studio that said, "Not at home," and was not seen on the streets of Beijing during the entire occupation. And he became a whispered national underground hero because he would not collaborate, would not cooperate. When they finally finished with the occupation, he celebrated by coming out for the first time and bought drinks for everybody in the neighborhood, and he became a national hero. When he died in 1957, he died in September, late September 1957, just a couple of weeks before Sputnik went up. I remember very well. This was the eulogy that was spoken over his funeral. And every major figure in China was at his funeral. Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, everybody, plus several million peasants and ordinary workers. Retaining the traditional character of the towering pine, keeping your conduct uncompromising as gold and jade, for 97 years you stood unbending like a jagged mountain peak, reflecting deservedly the true character of the laboring people, expressing the postures and feelings of rice and millet plants, depicting the lively interest of fish and insects in an era of new masses. You shone like a torch flame, adding brilliance to the grand scheme of peace pursuits. He was also an extraordinary poet and terse aesthetician. He said, "When I paint real objects, I don't really aim at close resemblance in their outward forms. Only when I capture verisimilitude without trying hard to imitate the configurations, there is the moving, rhythmic spirit of my work." We talked about the deep aesthetic principles 1,500 years ago in China. Xia Ho wrote down the 6 principles of good art, and the first one is always cited as the most important. Qi Yun Sheng Yang. It means that there is a life movement spirit resonance. For us, in our learning, it means that life has its concourse in nature, in the natural ecology, and it has a dynamic, which is the qi, the energy of life. And it's not that life is organic as opposed to inorganic. The so-called inorganic is already poised all the time to become organic. And in fact, in the cosmos, in interstellar, intergalactic space, there are many organic molecules that occur quite naturally. They're not yet beings, not yet creatures. But these organic molecules occur everywhere, even in interstellar clouds, intergalactic clouds of cold hydrogen will have traces of organic material. all of the hundreds of thousands of asteroid-like bodies that are out beyond Neptune, called the Kuiper Belt, almost all of them are made out of ice, water, and traces of organic elements. And we know now that comets very often come in from perturbations from the Kuiper Belt or even farther out the Oort cloud. And when they come in, they're carrying a lot of organics, a lot of water. And almost all the water that accumulated on planets like the Earth came because of bombardment by these icy comets. And the accumulation is all through not only our star system, but every star system, because we can pick up now through astrophysics that organic material is ubiquitous in the cosmos. So that life's concourse has this very special natural ability to emerge ubiquitously. What is mysterious is that spirit emerges ubiquitously whenever there is a completeness to the way in which a solution will become complete through its saturation, and then the next speck that's added to it will precipitate the crystals out of the solution, precipitate the forms out, the prismatic forms. So that the mind, when its experience source is saturated to the point where it is nourished, to where it is full to the saturation, any little thing will precipitate the jewels of artistic person spirit forms out of it. So that the quality is to have a fullness and a richness of nature, a fullness and a richness of experience. And when they are full, the forms that come out of them will be packed to the densification where the slightest little addition, the slightest little extra will perform the transform. So that the transformation is not done by making super energy. You don't have to have super energy at all. It's by having nourishment to the point of saturation, and then just one more thing. And the precipitation of spirit forms comes out of this, not naturally, but consciously. When Chipai Shi was a young man, before he became a great painter, he became fascinated by carving seals. And this is a book by my mentor, Kaiyu Shu, on Chipai Shi. And at one point, Chipai Shi had over 300 seals that he made himself, describing himself at various points in his life. Old man Pai Shi, being healthy at an advanced age, one seeks not to be an immortal. Already 85 years of age, Old Ping, the old dweller of the apricot grove, the old man who borrows mountains, floating name in excess of reality. And this quality of carving his seals is interesting because there are two ways that you can do it. There's a kind of a yang style where it is the impress of the red ink that shows, and then there's the yin style that shows the white, the intaglio form. And he mastered the way in which these different aspects of it come together, and in doing so, he tapped into the ancient Paleolithic rhythm of artistic expression. 40,000 years ago, when a Paleolithic artist would finish his composition, he would put a presence point in the composition like a Chinese seal, and he would use his hand. And he would dab his hand in his manganese oxide or his ferrous sulfate oxide, and he would make an impress on the wall, and you would see these red hands. Or he would take the mixture and mulch it with his saliva and then put his hand up and then blow so that the hand taken away would leave just the outline of the hand instead of the hand. Paleolithic hands are always red. Or they're outlined in red, just like Chinese seals are. It is a way of taking the natural color of blood that has been oxidized. Blood is rather bluish in the veins until it goes through and then becomes red because it's been oxidized and comes back. And so the color of oxidized blood, that kind of red, the Chinese red, the Paleolithic red, was always the way in which one put the hand, or in this distillation, the personally carved seal, which is not just your name as a family person or the name that was given to you, but is a description of a facet of your multidimensional spiritual personality, of your differential person, of your artistic person. Sometimes one of his seals read, "No such heaven-endowed thing in my hometown." And another, "The mountain flowers back home bloom at this time." And so he would take different facets of his creative imagination and he would make seals for them, and then he would put them onto paintings. And when he would finish a painting, he would usually put a poem, because he loved to do poetry as well. And he would put little inscriptions as well as poems. Here's one inscription. He said, "Painting real objects, I have no interest in resemblance of form. It is because of this my name remains obscure until old. That is fine with me." Henry Moore was just coming out of school, just beginning to be ready as a young man to test himself and to see what he could do. And he thought he might become a teacher. Out of the surviving 5 children in the Moore household, all the others generally became teachers. And just then the First World War broke out. And Moore was sent to the front. And he was enormously impressed with the vast carnage that was horrifying in the extreme. In this carnage, Moore became sensitized to the fact of women and children, and became a strong theme with them for the rest of his life. He saw women holding children, either here on the side, or feeding, or just at the belly level. And so he would get the sitting female form, and it became a theme with him, even later when he took the babies away. One of his first sculptures with the baby gone is just a cup left in the arm of the woman, so that the baby is now a space, not missing, not gone, but the baby is translated into spirit. So the mother is there in a chi way, the baby's there in a shen way. And so you get this interpenetration of form and space that becomes one of the great themes of Henry Moore's work. But the spaces eventually went all the way through so that they were spaces of complete openness, and they became holes. And the holes in Henry Moore's sculpture became very famous and phenomenal. Because as the holes developed, he realized that the spirit space could relate to chi forms, and so he began to have sculptures where there would be a form that was like the mother form and then a little form that was like the baby form, but they were separated in such a way that the sculptural tension between them radiated through the space and made them a set. They were not separated, but they were put into a set of two life forms related by spiritual energy spatially. And so his sculpture began to take on very, very interesting angles. And by the 1930s, we'll look at some Henry Moore's next week, he began to make reclining female forms that were perforated with spaces all through. And then he began to feel that there was a danger in the world as well, so that he began to make sheltering forms, a whole series of helmet-type sculptures where the space perforated volumes needed protection by an outer shell. And finally, one of the greatest sculptures of the 20th century was made on this very principle. He was approached by 4 scientists from the University of Chicago. And it was at the University of Chicago, right in Chicago, not far from the Museum of Science and Industry on Lake Michigan. It was in the University of Chicago that the world's first atomic reaction took place. Enrico Fermi and a number of scientists there made the first reaction, chain reaction there. And they were having to tear the building down, so they wanted to have a commemoration on the site of the first chain reaction on the planet. And so he made a sculpture, and they put it there where the building was. It's called Nuclear Energy. And you can see there's mushroom cloud resonances, there's helmet resonances, but there's a sculptural sense here that out of the rugged chaos of emergence comes this new cranium. This new ability for man not just to have a cranium for a brain that can think, but that there is now this new kind of a cranium that can translate thought into spirit, translate life energy through thought into spiritual consciousness. And that the new ability for man is to carry through so that he doesn't just stop with natural achievement, but that he goes on to supranatural resonances and developments, and is capable of doing this to any extent imaginable. And out of this, as we've seen in our phases, come not just the natural phases of nature, ritual, myth, and symbol, but the conscious phases of vision, art, history, and science. That whole conscious ecology comes beyond the cranium of the integral. When you see the blessed spirit beings, east and west, they're usually with a thought bubble around them, with a halo, with a space around the head to show that they are now capable of going outside the limitations of their mind. That when they go outside, what is carved out then is a Henry Moore type hole or space in the natural dimensions, And within that, one now has a supradimensional space of indefinite and plastic extent that can reach out anywhere and can also harbor high energies. Sometimes in Tibet iconography, you'll see nimbuses that are supercharged with radiant energy waves. It can be that way, but it's that way within complete openness. And so it is the openness of the spirit that Henry Moore began to work with. And just as he was being able to work with the reclining female body, now arranged so that the body would itself shelter the spaces of the openness, that the same reclining female now didn't need to have a helmet, but that she herself was the protection for her own openness, her own spaces, her own spirit places. And so that the body and the spirit spaces became interfused in such a way that by the end of the 1930s, he was all set to make incredibly new advances in the sculpture, and the Second World War came. And so he received a very peculiar assignment. In 1941, the Nazis began bombing London every day. Torrential bombings, indiscriminately killing civilians and damaging buildings, because it was an act of terror, not an act of war, to terrorize the population. And so the population of London, every day when an air raid siren would come out, they would go into the underground subway tunnels by the millions and line these tunnels. And it was a commission given to Henry Moore to go and sketch them. And so he spent a great part of 1941 sketching to record the supposedly terrorized population of London in these tunnels. And of course, it harkened back resonantly to his father being a coal miner, and have done his first sketches as a young man down in the coal mines of the coal miners. And so here, a decade or so after the next generation, after the whole population were now down in the mines. For Moore, it was almost a sobering quality that left his sculpture in such a way that when he came out of the Second World War, he didn't want to do his space, abstract, surrealist sculptures for a while. He began making, his first commission was of a Madonna for a church. And he made the Madonna and the little Christ figure in beautiful flows, so that the clothes and the flesh and the forms all were like a cascade of flows that were kept together by this circulation. And I'll show next week. But one of the things that came out of this was he began making groups of sculptures. This is three women. It's an ancient theme called the Three Graces. And you've seen the Three Graces in many Renaissance paintings. This is Henry Moore's Three Graces. What's interesting about these three feminine statues is that they were made to be very large, and they were made to be outside. Not to be in an art gallery, not to be in a museum, not to be in a building, but to be outside in nature. And the place where they were put is Battersea Park, which is off the west end of London, within commuting distance to take walks. And there in Battersea Park, for the first time, Henry Moore exhibited his works made for the landscape. He said sculpture belongs in the natural landscape. that it can work with the landscape and transform an entire landscape. So it is no longer just a natural landscape, but now becomes a spiritual place as well. And the reason he was able to do this is that in the mid-1930s, he had been successful enough. He and his wife, who was a Russian woman, she had been abandoned in the First World War, and she was raised by a surrogate mother for a year or two till the real mother could find her. And she was training for the ballet at one time in Russia and brought to England. And Moore met her at the Royal College of Art where he was teaching. They were married. In the mid-1930s, he did well enough that he decided that they needed to get out into the countryside, so he bought a cottage out near Canterbury, Kingston, in the far east on the Thames estuary. And there, for the first time, he began making sculptures outside. That he had, for the first time in his life, space, and his whole idea of sculpture suddenly radiated out. And instead of making things that were small, that you could have portable, he began making larger and larger sculptures and compositions. Eventually, he would make sculptures that were 40, 50 feet, enormous works. And not only that, but the space that they controlled was almost of amphitheatrical dimensions. One of the most successful sculptures that he did was for the Lincoln Center in New York City. And he put the sculpture in a reflecting pond so that the sculpture not only is massive by itself, but doubles itself by reflecting. And in the reflection, you get like this paired symmetry of the sculpture that seems to echo in resonance then, not only into the sky and into the space of Lincoln Center, but into the depths of the earth. Now, this is a very ancient, again, a Paleolithic way of delivering spirit reality. The earliest use on the planet of a reflecting pool to show the sky-like infinity in the earth in a sculptural way was at a place not far from Stonehenge, not far from Avebury. It's a hill called Silbury Hill out in the Wiltshire Plains in the west of England. It had puzzled people forever. No one had understood why it was that 5,000 years ago they would make this hill, and obviously they never put anything on it, and never did anything to it. They just scooped out the ground from below and mounded it up, leaving an embankment around kind of a place. And it wasn't until about 25 years ago, a young, brilliant visionary named Michael Dems went up to Silbury Hill again to try to see what he could make out of it. And this torrential rainstorm came down. And so he was stuck on the top of Silbury Hill. And when the rainstorm was over, he had his epiphany. He saw that the rain had collected, had run down the hillside, and had collected around the hill in the depression around it. And that he could see now the reflection of the sky in the water, so that the hill, suddenly he realized, was shaped like a breast, and with its reflection was like the breast, but they were floating in the sky of the earth, suspended. And he understood that this is a spirit form of the ancient goddess. That she now, at the end of each rainstorm, would be magically floating, giving her nourishment to the earth, there in the presence of this great sculptural work of art from about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago in England. Moore realized more and more that the forms that he made drew their energy from the earth and radiated it into the spiritual space of the art. And more he began to look to see that his beginning motifs were to take himself and collect little bits of nature, pieces of rock, pieces of bone, shells, whatever. And so his studio, wherever he had it, would be lined with shelves of these little natural knickknacks and trinkets and things. And then to keep everything hand-sized, we talked last week about how written language began with palm-sized cuneiform clay tablets. They were literally held in the hand. So that the whole thing of, did you get it, goes back to the origins of written language on little clay tablets that fit the palm. Yes, I got it. It's here. It's written down. It's said. For Moore, he understood that when he was working with sculpture, he needed to begin with palm-sized seeds, and he would call these maquettes. And so he would toy with visioning the natural forms, and then he would put a little bit of clay, or a little bit of plaster of Paris, or a little bit of something malleable in his hand, and he would begin to work with it, with the seed of it. And there would be that seed that he would expand, resonance by resonance, into the sculpture. So that the sculptures literally grew. They grew out of the seed, out of the maquette. And he would train himself so that he could see visionarily where this might go. Not where just this maquette, but every aspect of it. And so he became multidimensional visionary. He could see the cosmos in a single item and begin to see on what scalar it would be most potent in its harmonic. And so the size of his sculptures grew and grew. And one of the sculptures that you can find here in Los Angeles is over at the Norton Simon Museum. And it is called Standing Figure Knife Edge in Pasadena. You can find it there. Quite a very large piece. And you see by now that Moore's sculpture becomes increasingly capable of having a very odd double presence. It has earth energy that is drawn up into it, and then it has spirit energy that's spatially radiated out, and what one feels in that spiritual space is the artistic tension between memory and creative imagination, or remembering and the imagination. It's the tension of the exchange of those two in a pair of ways that creates a tension that is held by a frame. And the frame is our square of attention that we have been learning in our education. Because the square of attention for art is that it is based in mythic experience. It includes the symbolic mind. It includes the visionary consciousness, and then includes the differential form of the art. Whereas in nature, the square of attention, the frame of the picture, is nature, ritual, myth, and symbol. In art, it's shifted twice over and starts with myth, goes to symbol, then vision, then art. And so you have half of it that's integral and half that's differential, but the centers of the two exchange with each other, just like the Tai Chi symbol in China. So that memory and imagination exchange with each other in a pair of ways. And it is that double exchange that produces the sense of irony, that produces the thought of paradox, that produces the tension in art, but it also vivifies consciousness, so that consciousness has the center of life, imagination in it, but also has it so that it operates within its remembering as a flow. And it's that coming out of the source field that gives the artist the élan, is the best way to say it. Henri Bergson's creative evolution, he used the French term élan. It isn't just life anymore, it's the spirit of life. And so a work of art will have that, and a spiritual person will have it as well. They will be scintillatingly alive, not just alive. They'll be kaleidoscopically alive, like a jewel. More next week.